Picture this. A 9-year-old boy, barely old enough to understand the weight of a crown, suddenly thrust onto the throne of England in 1216. His father, the infamous King John, had just died, leaving behind a kingdom torn apart by civil war, rebellious barons, and the lingering shadow of Magna Carta. This child would grow up to rule for 56 years, one of the longest reigns in English history. But don't let the length fool you into thinking it was peaceful. This is the story of King Henry III, and his reign would be anything but serene. It would be marked by betrayal, civil war, brutal massacres, and political upheaval that would reshape England forever. By the time we're done, you'll understand why historians whisper about the bloodstained legacy of a king who started as an innocent child, but presided over some of the most violent chapters in medieval English history. When Henry inherited the throne, England was already bleeding. The First Barons' War was raging, a direct result of his father's refusal to honor Magna Carta. Rebel barons had even invited Prince Louis of France to claim the English throne, and French forces were occupying London. The young king's survival depended entirely on a regency council led by the legendary knight William Marshal, who had served 4 English kings and was now tasked with saving the realm for a 5th. Marshal's genius lay not in military might alone, but in political strategy. He immediately reissued Magna Carta, stripping away the clauses that had been most offensive to the Pope but keeping the core limitations on royal power. This brilliant move pulled the rug out from under the rebel barons, who could no longer claim they were fighting against tyranny when the new king had voluntarily accepted the very document they'd fought to establish. But even as Marshal and his fellow regents stabilized the kingdom and defeated the remaining rebels, they were unknowingly setting the stage for future bloodshed. Young Henry was watching, learning, and perhaps resenting every moment that others held power in his name. The boy king was developing ideas about royal authority that would prove catastrophically incompatible with his barons' expectations. When Marshal died in 1219, England lost not just a great knight, but perhaps the last man who could have taught Henry the delicate balance between royal power and noble cooperation. The regency continued under other capable hands, but the damage to Henry's understanding of kingship was already done. He was learning to see limitations on his power not as necessary compromises, but as humiliating restrictions that he would one day cast off. When Henry finally began his personal rule in 1227, the kingdom seemed ready for a new golden age. The 18-year-old king was pious, cultured, and genuinely devoted to the welfare of his subjects. He poured resources into magnificent building projects, most notably the reconstruction of Westminster Abbey in the stunning Gothic style that still takes visitors' breath away today. He was generous to the poor, devoted to his faith, and seemed to embody the ideal of Christian kingship. But beneath this glittering surface, fundamental problems were already festering. Henry's vision of kingship was fundamentally incompatible with the new reality Magna Carta had created. He saw himself as divinely appointed to rule as he saw fit, while his barons expected consultation, accountability, and respect for their traditional rights. This wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a collision between 2 completely different worlds of thought about how England should be governed. The first cracks in Henry's reign became visible through his disastrous financial management, a problem that would plague him for decades and ultimately contribute to the bloodshed that was to come. Unlike his predecessors, who had at least attempted to balance their books, Henry seemed incapable of understanding the connection between royal spending and political stability. He lavished money on foreign favorites, funded costly and unsuccessful military campaigns to reclaim lost French territories, and worst of all, committed England to financing the Pope's expensive wars in Europe. The most notorious example was the Sicilian affair, where Henry agreed to make his younger son Edmund King of Sicily, a fantasy that required England to pay crushing sums to the Pope while receiving absolutely nothing in return. Every failed campaign, every payment to Rome, every gift to a foreign courtier was another nail in the coffin of Henry's relationship with his nobility. But money alone doesn't explain the depth of baronial hatred that would eventually explode into civil war. Henry's perceived favoritism toward foreigners struck at the very heart of English identity and noble pride. First came the Lusignans, his half-brothers from his father's second marriage, who arrived in England expecting to be treated as princes despite having no legitimate claim to English lands or titles. Then came the Savoyards, relatives of his Queen Eleanor of Provence, who seemed to appear at court with alarming regularity and leave with English estates, titles, and positions that native nobles believed should have been theirs. These weren't just isolated appointments. They represented a systematic preference for foreign counsel over English wisdom, foreign interests over English needs. The English barons, many of whose families had served the crown for generations, watched in growing fury as outsiders gained the king's ear and England's wealth. The situation reached a breaking point in 1258, when a perfect storm of crises converged to create the most serious challenge to royal authority since Magna Carta itself. England was suffering from famine, the treasury was empty, the Pope was demanding enormous sums for the Sicilian venture, and Henry's military failures in France had become an international embarrassment. But the final straw was his request for more money from Parliament to fund yet another doomed foreign adventure. The barons had endured decades of financial mismanagement, foreign favoritism, and royal arrogance, and they were done asking politely for reform. Led by Simon de Montfort, ironically himself a Frenchman who had married into the royal family, they staged what amounted to a bloodless coup, forcing Henry to accept a revolutionary set of reforms known as the Provisions of Oxford. The Provisions of Oxford were nothing short of radical, stripping Henry of virtually all independent authority and placing effective control of the government in the hands of a council of 15 barons and clergymen. The king could no longer appoint his own officials, control his own finances, or make major decisions without baronial approval. For a man who believed himself chosen by God to rule England, this was not just a political defeat, but a spiritual humiliation. Henry agreed to the provisions because he had no choice. But from the moment he set his seal to the document, he was plotting to regain his lost power. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would drench England in blood and fundamentally alter the relationship between crown and nobility forever. What made the situation so volatile was that both sides believed they were fighting for the very soul of England. Henry saw the provisions as an illegal usurpation of divinely ordained royal authority, a rebellion against God himself that had to be crushed. The barons saw them as the restoration of proper governance, a return to the principles of Magna Carta that would save England from the chaos of arbitrary royal rule. Neither side was willing to compromise because neither side saw this as merely a political dispute. This was a holy war, and holy wars tend to be the bloodiest of all. When Henry obtained papal absolution from his oath to uphold the provisions and King Louis of France ruled in his favor at the Mise of Amiens, the die was cast. The Second Barons' War was about to begin, and it would be fought with a ferocity that shocked even medieval observers accustomed to violence. The baronial opposition was led by one of the most fascinating and contradictory figures in English history, Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. A French nobleman who had come to England as a young man, Montfort had initially been one of Henry's closest friends and had even married the king's sister Eleanor in a secret ceremony that caused a scandal at court. But Montfort's experience as Henry's lieutenant in Gascony had opened his eyes to the king's fundamental unfitness for rule. He had watched Henry make disastrous decisions, alienate crucial allies, and waste English resources on impossible dreams. Montfort was no democrat in the modern sense, but he genuinely believed that England could only be saved from Henry's incompetence by forcing the king to rule with proper counsel and restraint. He was also ruthlessly ambitious, and he may have seen the baronial cause as his path to power. Whatever his motives, Montfort would prove to be a formidable enemy, combining military genius with political innovation in ways that would terrify the royal court. The Second Barons' War began in earnest in 1264, and from the start, it was clear that this would be no chivalrous tournament with rules and honor. Both sides were fighting for survival, and they acted accordingly. The conflict spread across England like wildfire, with families divided, towns choosing sides, and local grievances exploding into open warfare. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the war was the systematic massacre of Jewish communities by Montfort's forces and supporters. These weren't random acts of violence, but calculated attacks designed to destroy records of debt and gain popular support from those who owed money to Jewish moneylenders. Jewish communities in Worcester, London, Canterbury, and Derby were targeted with particular brutality. Houses were burned, families murdered, and centuries of accumulated records destroyed. The brutal death of Simon de Montfort at Evesham marked the beginning of a savage period of retribution that would cement Henry III's reign as truly bloodstained. The king, freed from over a year of captivity and witnessing the gruesome dismemberment of his greatest enemy, initially showed no mercy to the remaining rebels. The disinherited barons, those who had fought alongside Montfort, found themselves stripped of their lands, titles, and livelihoods in a systematic campaign of royal revenge. Henry's initial approach was simple and merciless: complete forfeiture for all who had opposed him. Their estates were redistributed to loyal supporters, creating a new class of landowners whose wealth was built upon the blood of the Civil War. Yet the bloodshed was far from over. Across England, pockets of desperate rebels continued to resist from forest hideouts, island fortresses, and ancient castles. These men, calling themselves the disinherited, had nothing left to lose. They turned to guerrilla warfare, striking at royal supply lines, ambushing tax collectors, and terrorizing those who had benefited from their downfall. The fenlands of East Anglia became a particular stronghold for these desperate fighters, who used the treacherous marshes and waterways to launch surprise attacks before melting back into the wilderness. This was not the chivalrous warfare of knights in open battle, but a vicious, personal conflict that brought violence to every corner of the kingdom. The siege of Kenilworth Castle became the defining symbol of this prolonged bloodshed. The massive fortress, one of the strongest in England, held out for 6 grueling months after Evesham, its defenders knowing that surrender meant death or permanent exile. The royalist forces, led by Prince Edward, surrounded the castle with a ring of steel, but the walls were too strong for direct assault. Instead, they settled in for a war of attrition, cutting off all supplies and waiting for starvation to do their work. Inside the castle, the garrison included not just soldiers but women and children, the families of the rebels who had nowhere else to go. As winter approached, conditions became desperate, but still they held out, sustained by the faint hope that relief might come. The brutality of this period extended far beyond military targets. Henry's supporters, emboldened by their victory and hungry for revenge, launched attacks on anyone suspected of rebel sympathies. Monasteries that had sheltered fleeing rebels were ransacked, their treasures seized, and their abbots imprisoned. Merchants who had traded with Montfort's forces found their goods confiscated and their livelihoods destroyed. Even peasants who had shown support for the baronial cause faced brutal reprisals, their crops burned and their homes destroyed. The line between justice and vengeance had completely disappeared. The Jewish communities, already devastated by the massacres during the war, faced continued persecution in its aftermath. Many had fled to the Tower of London for protection, but even there they were not safe from royal demands for money. Henry, desperate to fund his ongoing military operations against the remaining rebels, imposed crushing taxes on the surviving Jewish population. Those who could not pay faced imprisonment, torture, or death. The ancient Jewish quarter in London, once a thriving center of commerce and learning, lay in ruins, its synagogues burned and its residents scattered or dead. This systematic persecution represented one of the darkest chapters in medieval English history. The Church, which had largely supported the royalist cause, now found itself complicit in the bloodshed. Bishops who had excommunicated the rebels were called upon to legitimize the harsh punishments being meted out. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Boniface of Savoy, the Queen's uncle, actively encouraged the persecution of rebel supporters, declaring that those who had opposed the divinely appointed king deserved no mercy. Monasteries were required to hand over any rebels seeking sanctuary, abandoning the ancient right of sanctuary that had protected fugitives for centuries. The moral authority of the Church, already compromised by its political involvement, suffered irreparable damage as it became an instrument of royal vengeance. Prince Edward, though only in his mid-20s, emerged as the true architect of the royal victory and the subsequent reign of terror. His escape from rebel captivity in May 1265 had turned the tide of the war, and his tactical brilliance at Evesham had crushed the rebellion. But Edward was not content with military victory alone. He understood that the rebellion had deeper roots in the grievances of the English nobility, and that lasting peace could only be achieved through a combination of harsh punishment for the rebels and careful management of the remaining barons. His methods were as ruthless as they were effective, earning him a reputation for cold calculation that would serve him well in his future reign. The resistance in the Isle of Ely became another focal point of continued bloodshed. This marshy island in the Cambridgeshire fens, accessible only by narrow causeways that could easily be defended, became a refuge for desperate rebels. Led by John Daville, a minor baron who had lost everything at Evesham, the rebels turned the island into a fortress. They raided the surrounding countryside, seizing supplies and recruits, while the royal forces struggled to mount an effective assault across the treacherous waterways. The siege dragged on for months, with both sides suffering heavy casualties from disease and malnutrition, as much as from actual fighting. The economic cost of this prolonged conflict was staggering. The royal treasury, already depleted by Henry's foreign adventures and the Sicilian affair, was drained by the need to maintain armies in the field against scattered rebel forces. Trade ground to a halt as merchants feared to travel roads controlled by desperate outlaws. Agricultural production collapsed in many areas as fields were abandoned by peasants fleeing the violence. The great fairs that had made England prosperous were cancelled or poorly attended, as the kingdom descended into economic chaos. The wealth that had taken generations to accumulate was squandered in months of bitter civil war. Henry's character underwent a profound transformation during this period of bloodshed. The pious, somewhat naive king who had been easily manipulated by advisors was replaced by a harder, more suspicious ruler. The trauma of his captivity, witnessing the violent deaths of so many nobles, and the constant threat of assassination had left deep psychological scars. He began to see enemies everywhere, trusting only a small circle of family members and foreign advisors. His famous generosity, once a defining characteristic, gave way to calculated cruelty as he learned to use fear as a tool of governance. The blood-stained years had created a blood-stained king. The gradual shift toward mercy came not from Henry's own inclinations, but from the pragmatic recognition that continued violence was destroying the kingdom. The Church, led by Cardinal Ottobuono Fieschi, the papal legate, began to advocate for reconciliation. The cardinal understood that England's ongoing civil war weakened the country's ability to support the Pope's broader political objectives, including potential crusades and conflicts with other European powers. More importantly, the economic devastation was reducing the tax revenues that the papacy relied upon from England. Religious principle and political necessity aligned to create pressure for a more moderate approach. The dictum of Kenilworth, issued in October 1266, represented a crucial turning point in Henry's blood-stained reign. This document, negotiated through the mediation of the papal legate, offered terms by which the disinherited rebels could regain their lands through payment of substantial fines. The amounts were punitive, typically requiring payment of 5 to 7 times the annual value of the estates, but they offered hope where before there had been only despair. For many rebels, it meant years of debt and reduced circumstances, but it was preferable to permanent exile or death. The dictum was a masterpiece of political calculation, offering just enough mercy to end the resistance while ensuring that the rebels would be financially crippled for years to come. Yet even this apparent mercy came with continued bloodshed. Many rebels simply could not afford the ransoms demanded for their lands, leading to renewed desperation and violence. Some attempted to raise funds through banditry, attacking wealthy travelers and holding them for ransom. Others sold themselves into the service of foreign powers, becoming mercenaries in the endless wars of continental Europe. The lucky few who could raise the money often found that their returned estates had been stripped of all valuable assets, their castles demolished, and their peasants scattered. The dictum offered redemption, but at a price that left many broken men with nothing but bitterness and dreams of revenge. The final surrender of Kenilworth Castle in December 1266 marked the symbolic end of organized resistance, but the bloodshed continued in sporadic outbreaks across the kingdom. The garrison, weakened by months of starvation and disease, finally agreed to terms that allowed them to march out with their weapons and horses. It was a face-saving gesture that masked the reality of their complete defeat. Many of these men would never recover from their losses, becoming a permanent class of displaced nobles whose resentment would simmer for decades. Their sons and grandsons would remember the blood-stained years and seek opportunities for revenge in future conflicts. The transformation of England's political landscape during this period was profound and lasting. The old feudal relationship between king and barons, based on personal loyalty and mutual obligation, had been shattered by the violence of the Civil War. In its place emerged a more complex system based on written agreements, legal procedures, and institutional checks on royal power. The parliament that Simon de Montfort had created in desperation would outlive its creator, becoming a permanent feature of English governance. The bloodshed had destroyed the old order, but from its ashes emerged the foundations of a more modern state. The massacres of Jewish communities during this period represented a particularly dark aspect of the blood-stained reign. These attacks were not random acts of violence, but calculated assaults on a vulnerable minority that served multiple purposes for the perpetrators. By destroying records of debts owed to Jewish moneylenders, the attackers freed themselves and their supporters from financial obligations. By seizing Jewish property and wealth, they funded their military campaigns. By targeting a group associated with royal protection and taxation, they struck at the king's financial base. The violence was systematic, deliberate, and devastating, leaving the Jewish community in England permanently weakened and traumatized. The role of foreign mercenaries in prolonging the bloodshed cannot be understated. Both sides in the conflict relied heavily on professional soldiers from France, Germany, and the Low Countries. These men had no stake in English politics beyond their wages, and they fought with a brutality that shocked even hardened English warriors. They showed no mercy to prisoners, looted indiscriminately from civilian populations, and committed atrocities that poisoned relationships between communities for generations. Their presence transformed what might have been a relatively civilized conflict between English nobles into a savage war of extermination. The impact on English society extended far beyond the immediate participants in the conflict. The breakdown of central authority led to a collapse of law and order in many regions. Local strongmen seized control of their areas, imposing their own rough justice and extracting tribute from terrified populations. Bandits roamed the countryside with impunity, knowing that there were no royal forces available to pursue them. The great trade routes that connected English cities became death traps for merchants, leading to severe shortages of basic goods and hyperinflation in many areas. The social fabric of the kingdom was torn apart by years of sustained violence. The psychological trauma of the blood-stained years left lasting scars on all levels of English society. Children who had witnessed the massacre of their communities grew up with a deep distrust of authority and a willingness to resort to violence to settle disputes. Nobles who had seen their peers butchered at Evesham became paranoid and suspicious, surrounding themselves with guards and viewing every political disagreement as a potential death sentence. The clergy, compromised by their support for one side or another, lost much of their moral authority and struggled to provide spiritual comfort to traumatized populations. The very concept of political opposition became associated with treason and death. Henry's attempts to rebuild royal authority in the aftermath of the Civil War required continued use of violence and intimidation. Suspected rebels were subjected to arbitrary imprisonment, torture, and execution. Royal agents conducted sweeping investigations into the loyalty of nobles, merchants, and clergy, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. The king's courts became instruments of political revenge rather than impartial dispensers of justice. This systematic use of terror succeeded in crushing organized opposition, but at the cost of alienating much of the population and creating a legacy of resentment that would plague future monarchs. The economic recovery from the bloodstained years proved slow and painful. The destruction of crops, livestock, and infrastructure during the Civil War had created widespread famine and poverty. The displacement of populations had disrupted traditional agricultural patterns, leading to abandoned villages and uncultivated fields. The death or exile of skilled craftsmen and merchants had crippled urban economies, while the destruction of bridges, roads, and ports had severed vital trade connections. It would take decades for England to fully recover from the economic devastation of Henry's blood-stained reign. The international reputation of England suffered severe damage during this period of internal bloodshed. Foreign courts viewed the English Civil War as evidence of the kingdom's weakness and instability, leading to diplomatic isolation and the loss of potential allies. Trading partners became reluctant to invest in English commerce, fearing that their assets might be seized or destroyed in renewed fighting. The Pope, despite his eventual role as mediator, was deeply concerned about England's ability to fulfill its obligations to the Church and contribute to broader Christian causes. The blood-stained reign had transformed England from a major European power into a source of concern and instability. The legacy of the blood-stained years would echo through English history for centuries to come. The precedent of armed resistance to royal authority, established during the Civil War, would inspire future rebellions and revolutions. The constitutional principles developed during the crisis, particularly the role of Parliament in limiting royal power, would evolve into the foundations of modern democratic government. The traumatic memories of civil war and political violence would make English society more cautious about pushing political disputes to the point of armed conflict, contributing to the development of more peaceful methods of resolving disagreements. As Henry III's reign drew toward its close, the blood-stained years had fundamentally transformed both the king and his kingdom. The naive, pious monarch who had ascended the throne as a child had become a hardened, suspicious ruler who understood that power ultimately rested on the ability to inflict violence on one's enemies. The kingdom he ruled had been purged of many of its most independent-minded nobles, replaced by men whose loyalty had been purchased with the lands of the defeated rebels. The ancient traditions of English governance had been replaced by new institutions forged in the crucible of civil war. So there you have it, the true nature of King Henry III's 56-year reign, a period that forever changed the relationship between the English crown and its subjects through decades of political upheaval and bloodshed. From the brutal massacres during the Second Barons' War to the savage dismemberment of Simon de Montfort at Evesham, Henry's rule was defined by violence, rebellion, and the deadly consequences of unchecked royal power. While his architectural legacy endures in the magnificent Westminster Abbey, and his reign inadvertently laid the groundwork for parliamentary democracy, the cost was measured in countless lives lost to civil war and political strife. Henry III may have died peacefully in his bed in 1272, but his blood-stained reign serves as a stark reminder that even the longest rules can be defined by their darkest moments.